make it clear.
Order. Well, I did not make the comments.
Well, it's not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Sure, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on a revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. She is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies, one of the best bloggers in New Zealand, Phoebe Fletcher. And he is an author, a columnist and a political commentator. Proof the revolution will be televised. Cris, Trotter, welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, how does the GCSB miss a $500,000 firework display by the person they are supposedly spying on? How incompetent can the case against Kim.com get? Issue 2, why do so many New Zealanders blame the parents for child poverty? And issue 3, 600 job losses in a week equals 600 families without an income. When does unemployment start impacting politically? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. The latest revelations of the Kim.com mega conspiracy highlight a jaw-dropping incompetence by our intelligence and police services and the seeming utter lack of oversight of the agency by our Prime Minister is bewildering. Cris, help me out here. How can Key meet the GCSB 15 times and they not once mention the largest FBI operation against an individual in New Zealand's history focused on someone who lives in John Key's electorate?
Well, I think this whole charade has allowed us a glimpse into what has probably been quite a usual train of events in New Zealand, but which, because, as we have learned this week, ministers can issue the courts with what are essentially suppression orders, we just never hear about. Everywhere agencies like the GCSB have been established, they have been used for unauthorized and sometimes illegal purposes. Every time you remove transparency and effective oversight from an intelligence agency, they abuse their power. In the 1970s, I think it was the Church Committee exposed the most extraordinary series of illegal and quite immoral events over 2 or 3 decades by the CIA. This coincided with the Watergate scandal, of course. So people's faith in the American federal government took a huge hit. But what we have seen here is the result of Mr.com's high-powered legal representation. They spotted an inconsistency in the testimony of the police and they hunted it down and they forced the GCSB to come clean. Now, you've got to ask yourself, how many times has this happened before where there hasn't been a Mr.com and a high-powered legal team who have forced this agency to expose what it's been doing?
Does John Key have a credibility gap on this issue now?
Oh, I suspect that John Key rues the day he ever heard the name Kim.com, because Kim.com is, with an extraordinary Teutonic thoroughness, shredding the Prime Minister's credibility.
Phoebe, there is a deep suspicion that this entire case is America flexing its muscles to China, that we're under its jurisdiction. Does the involvement of the GCSB deepen that suspicion?
Oh, I would say that it's not so much about flexing its muscles to China, although we do have those movements going on through the Pacific, you know, because you've had China expand throughout the Pacific Islands by building buildings and so on to get UN votes. But I think that this is much more aligned with the issues over copyright, and this is where we have seen the United States take a very aggressive stance to intellectual property. And, you know, I mean, this has been the home of the cultural industry since the 1920s. So I think it is much more to do with preserving that kind of empire. I think that I myself and other people within media studies do believe that on some counts there they are fighting a losing battle, right, in terms of the way that the internet is structured. But there are serious issues, obviously, with the way that they have let the United States come into the country on this case. But as Cris says, I don't think that this is something uncommon. I think it was Gordon Campbell that was drawing the parallels between this and the Ahmed Zawi case, where, you know, I think that this is just one of those moments where his legal team have exposed the kind of movements that go on with probably quite a lot of regularity.
Do you think the GCSB, as part of the Echelon surveillance network, would have passed information about Kim.com to the Americans when they are so keen on this individual?
I would be very surprised if they hadn't, to be honest. Yeah.
I think it happens, as Kim.com himself said, in real time, because I think the NSA in Maryland gets everything that we get. I'm not sure whether it works the other way around.
No, I suspect it does not.
But I think the NSA would almost certainly have had all that information pretty much in the same instant we did. Whether or not they then passed it to the FBI, only time will tell.
There's been speculation that the real reason Key waited to release this information was because Leon Panetta was in the country, and if this had been released then, he would have faced embarrassing questions from the local media, seeing as he's the former boss of the CIA. How credible is that?
Well, I find the Prime Minister's answers utterly incredible.
Right.
I simply do not believe that the person responsible for this bureau was not kept up to speed. I find it absolutely incredible that the Deputy Prime Minister didn't have a word with the Prime Minister. I mean, I think it's important that these denials are made on the part of the government and on the part of the Bureau. Otherwise, even more questions will be asked. I think the basic default position, if you like, of the government in relation to these kind of intelligence and security matters is blanket denial when they are unfortunate enough to have to say anything at all.
Phoebe, why are the New Zealand police trying to get the GCSB to do things they can't do? I mean, don't we control the police's ability to spy on private citizens for very good reasons?
Well, I think, you know, with the Security and Surveillance Bill, there has been a lot of stuff that has gone through around those. But I think, you know, as Cris says, this is kind of because they have put it under the notion of national intelligence. This is where we're getting the rules flouted. And as Cris has said, we're not going to get much out of this inquiry at all because, you know, it is their job not to say anything to a certain extent, although you know, it's really going to be interesting in terms of the ramifications that this has, that we're allowing people to spy on.
I think the other interesting thing is what's going to happen back in the United States. Because Mr.com has got powerful legal teams operating in both countries now. And the United States, for all its faults, still has a reasonably robust freedom of information regime. Now, I'm sure Ira, whatever his name is, the wonderful figure that is holding up the legal end in the United States, will be beating the bushes for all he is worth to find out, A, if it went to the NSA, and B, if the NSA gave it to the FBI. And if it's been in the possession of the FBI, you've really got to wonder how much longer this extradition business
I mean, it's
will
interesting
last.
because there was the Auckland University law professor Bill Hodge talking about this, and he was saying that doesn't actually affect .com's copyright case, but what it does do is it creates big problems for the government, especially when John Key is facing questions around John Banks and this kind of notion that is becoming very popular at the moment, that the National Party kind of turn a blind eye to things that are sort of corruption.
The biggest problem the American authorities would face would be if it turns out that this FBI case against Mr.com has been months in the making, and I suspect that it has, because the FBI is nothing if not thorough, and I suspect that they have had him in his sights, you know, for many, many months. Now, if he was under surveillance courtesy of the GCSB, and the NSA was then passing this information to their fraternal security operation in the FBI, then it's possible that even in the formulation of the case against him in the United States, he could be facing problems.
Final question of both of you. Will this desire by our police force and intelligence agencies to throw New Zealand law aside for American interests, will that damage Murray McCullough's attempt at getting a New Zealand chair at the UN?
No, I don't think so, because I think that the UN is kind of complicated in terms of its politics with the Security Council.
Yep.
Anyway, I mean, there's certain countries that dominate that forum. I think that this is kind of, you know, in some ways ideologically it does reflect a long-held desire by the National Party to get closer to the United States in terms of foreign affairs.
Can we seriously claim to be independent after this fiasco?
Well, yes, what I would say in relation to securing a place on the Security Council is that in the past we have been able to go to the countries of the developing world and say, look, we are hated by the Americans, just like you are. So give us your support. Well, when Mr. Mineta is in town and telling us that he's happy to have our warships in his harbours, and hey, look, we could even give you some Marines if you'll give us a base. It's going to be harder to persuade the developing world that we're independent.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, the reaction to the reality of child poverty in the wake of more draconian welfare crackdowns has been extraordinary. If you tune in to Talkback or read the letters to the editor, there seems to be a very large chunk of New Zealand who blame the parents for child poverty. Phoebe, why do so many New Zealanders blame parents for child poverty, and more importantly, why are they using that belief to block the idea to fund and feed kids in schools?
It's interesting. I was just actually going back through, I mean, I come from a cultural studies department, and obviously we cross over into sociology, and these are things or questions that have been considered for many years within my discipline, particularly since the 1970s, where you get this kind of growth of, you know, aspirational ideals of the middle class. One of the things that we would look to say is that poverty, in terms of, you know, this notion that it's the parents' choices and so on, we would say that there are different forms of capital within society, that class is not just enforced through the amount of money you have, it's your access to education and so on. Okay, so someone like Pierre Bourdieu would say that some of the poor choices that seem to congregate in terms of statistically around people with lower means of access to money are things that are a result of a lack of access to the kind of the means of education that other classes might have. In the same way that if you come from a wealthy family, you might be better off at working the tax system than somebody that's from a lower family. I think the reason why a lot of New Zealanders do blame those parents is because there is a kind of desire, I think, when economic times become harder, to find somebody else to pick on. But I also think it's the way that these are kind of broader institutional structures. We're talking about percentages of people, and the way that they're quite often discussed by politicians is that it tends to be individualised down to, you know, the guy on the roof next door for David Shearer and so on. And then once it becomes that individual level, it becomes easy to pick people apart. But what we are looking at here is we are looking at statistics. We're looking at 50% of these parents being Pākehā. We're looking at 40% of these parents actually working. You know, on the radio, national radio, when I was just coming in here before, you know, it's estimated, I think it was as much as 40% of people with part-time jobs in Australia constitute what we would call the working poor. So the debate is becoming oversimplified in New Zealand, I
Cris,
believe.
you wrote one of the best blogs I read this week on this issue, and I urge people who are watching the show to go along and read it. You make the point that the distance between the two New Zealands, between the haves and the have-nots, is so vast now that many New Zealanders who have never experienced poverty or hunger are totally disconnected from the reality of poverty in our country. How's that happened in egalitarian New Zealand?
Well, yes, I think it's primarily a failure of people's imagination, not to mention evidence of a lack of empathy. And I think that's probably the most egregious aspect of all this, is that people simply won't put themselves in the shoes of others. And I suppose if you've never even come close to the situation in which many people now find themselves, you can't put yourself in their shoes. You don't have the experience, you don't have the imaginative capacity to conceive of what it might be like to have none of the things that you take for granted. Sure, many of us have been poor, but for middle class people there's always mum and dad or grandma and grandpa.
Right.
For middle class people there's always a knowledge base of how the system works and where you go to get the things that you need. There's an awareness of what your rights are, and you are able, you're articulate, you're better informed than most of your fellow citizens. You're likely to be able to confront a caseworker at WINS and make them listen to you and make them give you the things to which you are entitled. But there is a huge number of New Zealanders who don't have any of those things and so struggle. And of course, you know, the truly immoral aspect of all this is that by blaming the parents, these people take their eyes off the children. And there is simply no way that you can blame a child for making poor personal choices, unless you go to the absurd position of blaming the child for not choosing the right parents in the way that Gina Reinhardt did recently in the in Australia.
I think just kind of cutting in there, and you know, this idea that you might be able to blame individuals, we are looking at social problems. I mean, one thing that Claudette and I were talking about last week when she was saying it's their problem with their high levels of personal debt, well, that's something that we also see in the middle classes in New Zealand. It's something that the IMF wrote a report on the state of our economy that, you know, it's people's desires for mortgages that actually make our economy fragile. So I don't think that we would talk about the middle classes when the finances companies collapse and so on in such a, you know, do they moralistically deserve it way, that, you know, there is a real sort of problem with the way that we are talking about poor in our
I think there's another problem here, and it's a political problem from the point of view of the right. If you look back in New Zealand history to the 50s, 60s and through the 70s, you'll find that there was a kind of understanding. It was that there was a very large degree of social solidarity up to quite a high level of comfort and security in terms of the whole population. Above that, yes, if you were lucky, if you were skillful, if you chose the right parents and inherited vast sums, then, you know, you could have more.
So there was a social floor.
That's right, but it worked on the basis of universality. That was the first point. You had things like the family benefit, which even rich people got. But the quid pro quo was that rich people paid much higher taxes. Right? When people said, "But I don't need this. You know, I don't need this family benefit. I'm a wealthy person." The response, you know, from both National and Labour was, no, you don't, but you have a right to it as a citizen, and we claim it back off you by charging you 66 cents in the dollar as the top marginal tax rate. So don't feel guilty, because you are contributing and you're not taking something that you don't have a right to, because all of these things you have a right to as a citizen. You are entitled to them. And now entitlement has become a dirty word.
So we've actually downgraded our worth as citizens?
Well, I think what we've done is we've said your worth is determined by your own efforts. As Phoebe said, we forget about the kind of collective experience of poverty which gave rise to the welfare state. You see, I mean, it only takes 2 generations for the kind of historical lessons to be lost. There was a huge number of middle class people in the 1930s who suffered along with working class people. Because the devastation of the Great Depression was very indiscriminate. It really didn't care whether you were middle class or working class, and really only the super wealthy escaped.
Final question to both of you on this. Are we in denial about child poverty, and what are the costs of that denial?
Well, yeah, absolutely in denial, and I think the costs of this are huge. I mean, studies have shown that for every dollar that you spend in early childhood education, you get back $7. So the problem is that by not dealing with this poverty, we are going to end up with larger bills down the road in terms of our health costs and so on. So this is an urgent issue that must be dealt with.
Are we in denial?
Yes, and in essence, it's a moral question, and I think the denial and the blame game that so many people are playing is because I think in their hearts they know that the situation that New Zealand now finds itself in is wrong.
I ask people to check out Chris's blog. It really is quite fantastic. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, 600 job losses in a week equals 600 families without an income. When does unemployment start impacting politically? Cris, terrible week for hundreds of families across the country. When John Key isn't reading police reports on John Banks or GCSP reports on Kim.com, is he reading The Economy?
Well, yes, he is, and so are his colleagues, but they have a view about economies, and ours in particular, and that is that government has only a very limited role to play in the creation of jobs, and that indeed when governments attempt to intervene in the marketplace to create jobs, they often make the situation worse.
So Keynes was wrong?
That is an article of faith. Oh yes, well, Keynes was supposedly, thrown into the dustbin of history back in the 1980s.
Right.
And these politicians are still holding fast to the neoliberal ideology which supplanted Keynesianism. It's interesting that a commentator like Colin James, writing in the ODT this week, is making some very interesting statements. Now, Colin, bless him, was one of the cheerleaders of the reforms of the 1980s. Now we hear him saying that the orthodoxy of the 80s, 90s, right up until the present, is under threat, is certainly under challenge, and that there are glimmerings of a new orthodoxy emerging right across the world. And he was quite complimentary about the New Zealand Labour Party, particularly the Davids, Cunliffe and Parker, in relation to the way they're looking at economics. But from the point of view of Mr. Key, from the point of view of Mr. English and Mr. Joyce, you don't interfere. The market will put things right, and Mr. Joyce is very good at when people say you've lost 600 jobs, you say, but look, there were 400 jobs there and there are 1,000 jobs about to be created there. He's got the spin.
Phoebe, 45% support in the last opinion poll is only 2% less than they gained on election night. New Zealanders are still refusing to blame John Key's government for the economy. When does that start to change for the opposition?
When does that start to change for the opposition? I think when the opposition gets stronger, to be honest.
Right.
I don't mean to be rude, but we have seen a relatively weak opposition. I mean, Matt McCartan did a great piece on the lack of press releases that were going out from Labour. I think they have stepped up their game now. But even Shearer on The Nation this weekend, there's a massive difference between the way he performs on television and the way that he performs in Parliament. And this is something that, I would say that in terms of from Labour's perspective, they should be seeing the national government as so open, as so exposed to attack at the moment. There are kind of prime opportunities to be making these attacks, and they just don't seem to be getting through.
Final question to both of you. Last quarter unemployment was 6.8%. Has it peaked? What's your prediction for this year?
Oh, the statistical recording of unemployment, as Phoebe alluded to earlier, is so difficult now. If you have a couple of hours work a week, you're counted as employed, even though you're not earning enough to pay your rent or buy enough food. So I really don't know. I suspect that in New Zealand life is pretty grim for a much greater number of New Zealanders than 6.8%.
6.8%, is that the peak, or are we going to go higher?
Well, I think it's as that Roy Morgan poll that you posted on, that we could be looking at underemployment of another 9-10%, and this is something that they're seeing in Australia as well. This is something that Charles Leadbeater, the guy behind the knowledge economy, I mean, this is something that has been picked up within sociology and other disciplines like that for quite some time.
So the real unemployment rate could be a lot bigger.
We're moving towards a kind of casualisation of the workforce, which means that people, in some cases, are underemployed. And that creates all kinds of social problems.
Let's wrap the show with a final word, ladies and gentlemen. Last word this week, Phoebe.
I would like to see more fact-checking by journalists. I would have to say that Russell Brown, I think, did a fabulous job together with Gordon Campbell in pointing out that Paula Bennett's beneficiary figures have been way off, where she was maintaining that 60% of people on the dole had been on it for more than 10 years. And the figures were just absolutely extraordinarily off. And I think that there has been a lot of this in terms of, you know, the retorts of those sorts of ministers towards cabinet reports. We've seen it in Parliament quite a bit lately. That I think that this is something that there needs to be closer scrutiny on, especially when the numbers are so significantly out. It's 10% of people on DPBs that have been on it for over 10 years.
That's right.
So not 60% of people on the dole.
Cris, your final word this week?
Oh, I just want to raise concern at what's emerging in the justice area. The minister has just, you know, announced changes to, you know, parole. And one of the things which emerges from that whole process is that you will be punished now, in the sense that you won't get a parole hearing if you don't accept your guilt. Now, how many New Zealanders over the last 10 years have been freed, have been paid compensation by the government because it has turned out that they were innocent, that they were found guilty, sometimes twice, and yet, you know, usually with DNA evidence, it has been proved that they could not have committed the crime. Now, if you can't get parole until you say that you are guilty, then, you know, that is wrong. That is doing huge damage to people, both in terms of keeping them in prison longer than they probably should be, or in the case of those who are genuinely innocent, you know, you're just compounding the injustice that's been done to them. So I think people should have the right to say, I didn't do it. Sometimes in the case of sex offenders, like the notorious Beast of Blenheim, you know, it's a mental problem. They can't accept their guilt. In other cases, they are innocent.
Thank you, Cris. Thank you, Phoebe. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word, you've got to give Stephen Joyce an A+ for Best Spin of the Week, trying to claim that environmentalists should drop their complaints to opening a new mine on the environmentally important Denniston Plateau because miners need jobs in the wake of the massive solid energy cuts are some of the most disingenuous, crooked words ever spoken over mining. 1, why is the minister getting involved in a case currently in front of the court? 2, the Denniston Plateau is an hour and a half away from the Spring Mine. It's not just down the road, and Joyce's constant use of nearby to describe the distance is as credible as Key's position on the GCSB. And finally, 3, the job cuts at Solid Energy wouldn't be occurring if Solid Energy wasn't preparing itself for sale. Yes, coal stocks are huge in China and that is driving prices down, but a government can look to the long-term price cycles of coal and plan to that. Shareholders wanting a return in the next quarter won't give a damn. For Joyce to attack environmentalists for job losses his government's policies are causing are crooked words from a crooked mouth. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook account. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on